Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines remain unchanged, so exam 2 covering part 2, quiz and assignments part 3, deadline not this Friday but next Friday, April 5th, end of day, so to 9 p.m. Exam 3, exam 4, quiz and assignments part 4, April 26th, also end of day. And then again, exam 5, the exciting final, covering all things, deadlines at the Wednesday finals week at 5 p.m. As mentioned previously, to see if you need to follow or not, once you've done the 4 exams, all the quiz and assignments you wish to do, get the grade estimator, plug in the numbers, and that'll show you whether the final could help you or not. And again, if you don't do it, it's already a 0, so nothing would change. There would be like a shocking result or suddenly your grade plummets. Before heading to a recap of Chapter 10, then on to adventures in Chapter 11, anything about stuff to be, or stuff that has been, that needs more stuff. So previously in Chapter 10, we were looking at the various methods of inductive reasoning, and we saw that they all have in common the fact that they're arguments. So everyone's got a premise or premises in a single conclusion, but they deal in probability. Being the premise being true makes the conclusion probably true. And that is measured in terms of being strong or weak. Unlike deductive arguments, which are strictly bipolar, valid, invalid, inductive arguments are strong or weak, and at varying degrees. And that assessment is a matter of the standards we apply to it. And we looked at a variety of inductive argument types, such as the statistical syllogism, where most x's are y's, this is an x, therefore this is a y. Then this depends on the idea of the percentage. So if we say that most humans have brown eyes, the next person to the door is human, they have brown eyes, the strength of that depends on what percentage of humans have brown eyes. So pretty simple argument, pretty simple standard. Then we looked at the inductive generalization, its various forms, where you have a population you want to know about, and so you extract out a sample, observe the sample, and extend or generalize the results back to the whole population. And we saw the critical thing there is the sample like the whole population? So you want it to be big enough as opposed to too small, and you want it to be representative as opposed to biased. And a common way to do this is pull out a sample at random, and if you go into survey stuff, you'll see there's all kinds of techniques for making it more representative, like the stratified random sample. Then we look at the argument by analogy, which says that things are alike in certain ways, so they're alike in some other way. And we saw that can be used in law, history, also logic as well, of course. And the way to assess that is how alike the two things are. For example, President Trump recently signed an executive order requiring universities to support free inquiry. And the basic idea is there'll be financial punishments if this is not occurring. And the concern is that universities and professors are all leftist, and they're keeping criticism of Trump's words, hard left ideology from being criticized. Now, one could argue in favor of this by drawing an analogy to Title IX. And Title IX, of course, is the law that says there can't be discrimination based on sex and education. So you can't have disparity based on sex. And so you could argue this is similar, the same sort of thing except with ideology. If you can't discriminate based on sex, then the arguments for that would also extend to based on ideology. And the question would be, is that a good comparison? Are the two things enough alike to justify the conclusion? And so you battle over an argument by analogy, essentially by saying, if you favor it, they're alike in relative ways, and they're not too dissimilar. If you dislike the analogy or think it's flawed, you would argue that they're not enough alike, and that they're too different and too many and too relevant ways for it to work. And then it can become a real battle over what is relevant and what is not, and what is similar and what is not. Then it went on to the various fallacies. And the way to sort those out, as we saw, are the following ways. Age generalization, best way to remember that is, built into the name. Sample that is too small, it's taken hastily, too quickly, so sample too small for the purpose at hand. The bias generalization has got some factor that makes it non-representative, and then we saw the anecdotal evidence, which is a type of Bayesian generalization because the sample is too small, but the problem that occurs is the sample is very small, but it's based on an anecdote or two, and sort of the paradigm case is that there is a story, an anecdote, that goes against, sort of explicitly, against statistical evidence. Like when people say, yeah, I've heard that exercise is good for you, but that runner dropped dead during the Chicago Marathon, so running will totally kill you. And that'd be anecdotal evidence. Then we saw the self-selection fallacy, where the people self-select. They have to overcome like a meaningful barrier or hurdle to participate, which means it kind of biases them out. And a good metaphor is like a wall. If people go up to the wall, they might say, not worth getting over it. And so that selects out people who don't want to climb the wall, and selects people who can't climb the wall, and so you end up with a non-representative sample, metaphorically speaking. Then we looked at the Bayes generalization, and then it ended. Now we turn to chapter 11. But before that, anything about 10 that needs any more 10 stuff? Okay, so those are the key things. The main takeaway is, in terms of practical stuff, is having these inductive tools now, statistical generalization, argument by analogy, reductive generalization, and being aware of the fallacies so you can reason better about this type of stuff. In practical terms, it'll be especially relevant with the upcoming elections, because we'll see lots of surveys, etc., and being able to understand what they actually mean will be something that this can help you with, because they're all inductive generalizations. Okay, chapter 11, not bankruptcy, but more inductive reasoning. So we continue our adventures in inductive logic. But of course, since the whole of the chapter, it's got to be something new. So what is the new inductive stuff? Well, our focus here will be on explanations and causation. Essentially, why and how. So sort of our first objective is this, being able to sort out arguments from explanations. Secondly, look at two types of explanations. In previous editions of the book there were 3, but they winnowed it down to 2. Maybe the latest version has like 27, who knows. Then look at how you assess explanations to see if they're good, bad, or ugly. Then we'll turn to causal reasoning. And causal reasoning involves figuring out how stuff works. And we do this all the time. For example, if you go to use your phone and it gets to the lock screen and just locks up, then you want to know why, so you could get to the interwebs. And figuring that out would be involved making a causal hypothesis. Why does it happen? How do I fix that? Then we'll look at how to confirm these. So if we have suppose you think like the latest update to iOS caused the problem, and then you'd want to confirm that, check that, see if that is correct. We'll also look at problems in causal reasoning. And there are many classic fallacies, so no escape from the fallacies. And our look at causation will basically split into 3 main areas. One is individual causality, like why is my phone not working? Secondly, causation in populations, so questions like, does too much salt cause high blood pressure? And then we'll look at problems of causal reasoning, classic mistakes. And then we'll finish up looking at how causation applies to law. So explanations versus arguments. Now, as we saw back in the ancient days and before time, arguments in the philosophical sense are not fights, battles, or disagreements. They're attempts to establish that a claim is true by offering premises, reason or evidence for that claim, what is known as the conclusion. So the way to spot an argument is to ask the 2 classic questions. Question 1, what is the point? And that would be trying to find a potential conclusion. If there is a point, the next question is, what are the reasons or evidence offered? and that's a question that inquires for the premises. If you find both, the conclusion and premises, then you get an argument. It may be good, it may be bad, it may be ugly, but at least you get an argument. If there's no point, no argument. If there are no reasons or evidence, no argument. Now, explanations have a different objective. Their goal is not to establish the truth of a conclusion by offering premises in a logical structure, hopefully logical structure, but their goal is to enhance our understanding so that we understand how or why something occurred, is occurring, or how something or why something works, or perhaps doesn't work. So logically, the mission objective of an argument is the mission objective of persuasion, which we saw, back in the past, is getting people to believe it, whether it's true or not. The objective of explanation as an explanation is not to get people to believe it, well, you kind of want them to believe if you're giving one, and it's not to establish that something is true, rather the objective is to get someone to understand. So after they get the explanation, their understanding goes from less to more. So this means that the victory conditions for explanations can vary quite a bit and be very, contextual. So the same explanation may be terrible in one context, but great in another, for a variety of reasons. For example, if you're explaining something, in a graduate class about how stars work, you need a really complicated, accurate mathematical explanation. If you're explaining it, how stars work to preschoolers, giving that explanation would be a terrible one. You'd want something far simpler. And so depending on the context, an explanation may be good in one context, could be terrible in another. Now arguments and explanations do, of course, exist together, kind of like dinosaurs and giant insects. And we have to, of course, be able to tell them apart, but this can be kind of problematic. In some cases, it's pretty easy. Clearly argument, clearly explanation. In other cases, something may seem like it's an argument, but be an explanation. Or there can be things where people use an explanation to argue. For example, when a person is arguing that they deserve a makeup or extension to a paper, they might explain that they were sick or injured or in a car accident, and the explanation would be used as part of the argument. They would say, I should be allowed to make this up because I was sick, here are my excuses. Or I was injured, here are my excuses. And so they can work together. But they have different objectives. So the way to tell is, ask yourself, what is this trying to do? If the answer is trying to establish the truth of a claim, argue. If it's trying to give an account of how or why something occurred, explanation. If it's not clear, maybe you have a case where they're both kind of smushed together. You have something that's both trying to includes an explanation and an argument. You can also sometimes tell by the structure, the way it's built. Generally though, if someone's good enough to structure their arguments well, they're good enough at doing that to make it clear what's going on. But it's important, as we'll see, because there's a fallacy associated with this, to keep them separated. Now in this edition of the textbook, the authors went from 3 explanations down to 2. They used to have a third one called functional. Now they're just 2. I guess maybe because they need to change editions so they can sell them for more money and stuff. The first one is the physical causal explanation, the second, the behavioral. Essentially this corresponds roughly to the classic dualism of body-mind. So what are physical causal explanations? Well, not surprisingly, they're physical, and they're causal, and they're explanations. So you got 3 things going on there. Thing 1, physical. Now, there could be, of course, philosophically, a great debate over what counts as physical. Our good dead friend René Descartes provided a definition that physical things are extended in space and time, but don't think. The classic body. Of course, if you're someone like this guy, George Berkeley, he's the tree falls in the forest guy, he believed there weren't any things composed of matter. Everything that seems physical is just an idea. everything is literally mental. We live in the matrix where there's nothing outside of the matrix. And God's right in the matrix, so it's cool because God's not all evil and stuff. But we can push aside that philosophical thing because that gets all complicated. And we can just go with kind of the common sense view, which is physical stuff is the stuff covered by the hard sciences. So-called hard because it's difficult to pass those classes. Things like physics, biology, chemistry, genetics, neuroscience, etc. The things, intuitively, the things that deal with, well, material stuff, non-thinking, non-feely stuff. So the way we'll define it is the physical part deals with the hard sciences. Sometimes, circularly called the physical sciences, and again, physics, chemistry, biology, neuroscience, genetics, etc. All that stuff. And it's causal, because it's about how things work, and explanation, because it's trying to tell us how this occurs. Now, when making a physical explanation, you would use the physical background, and you explain it, shockingly enough, in terms of the hard sciences. For example, a long time ago, there was a big ship called the Titanic, and which they had made a movie on, very successful movie. Now, one of the questions is, of course, why did the supposedly, unsinkable ship sink? Now, when you're giving a physical causal explanation, you focus on all the physical parts, all the hard science stuff. Now, even if you're just focusing on the physical aspects, there are a variety of complications. Namely, what particular angle or lens are you using to look at this scenario? There would be kind of the complete picture, which would cover everything, but depending on your purpose or expertise or interest, you'd focus on different things. So, for example, looking at the Titanic, if you were a metallurgist, someone who does metal, not heavy metal, but metal, you'd be concerned about the nature of the hull, which was iron, and how the hull interacts with the cold water and with the ice. And one thing that happens with iron is that, like many things, when it gets cold, it gets brittle, so it breaks easier. Kind of like, well, you can take a simple example with a candy bar. If it's not frozen or if it's kind of warm and kind of melty, and you drop it, it's not going to break that easily. But if you freeze it and drop it, it breaks easy. And water is a pretty good example of this too. Non-frozen water, you drop it, it can't even break. Frozen water, yeah, it can. And so if you're looking at the standpoint of metals, you'd be concerned like iron composition, etc. If you were, say, interested in the mechanics and physics of motion, you'd look at it in terms of, kinetic, energy, the motion of the boat, striking the iceberg, etc. If you were a naval architect, a person who designs ships, you'd be concerned about the design of the Titanic. And so one of the reasons why the ship sank, even though it was designed not to, was in large part based on the design. One thing they had going on was bulkheads, and what they're supposed to do is keep the entire ship from flooding. You ever seen like submarine movies or something? They're always running and trying to close those things. There's always somebody caught behind them dramatically saying, "Go on without me." And the way they're supposed to work is, if you get a damage to the hull here, the water comes in but doesn't go elsewhere, so you're okay. One problem with the design of the Titanic is the bulkheads didn't go all the way up to the watertight ones to the top deck. So it got cut along the side of the hull, so this fills up, and then just like a bathtub, you keep the water going in a bathtub, it goes bloop over the side. Then this one filled up, and then bloop, this one filled up. And eventually, of course, what happens is you get so much weight on this part of the ship that the ship cracks, and then you're done. Then it's plunging to the bottom, and Titanic is sunk. And then years later, James Cameron makes $1 billion. You can see Leonardo DiCaprio die, worth every penny. Not that I think against him, but he just does his pretty good death scenes. So that would be a physical explanation of the death of the Titanic and how billions of dollars, well, actually, that'd be a behavioral explanation. So physical explanations work like that. And so the way to spot one, like on a quiz or assignment or exam, would be to ask yourself, is this given in just physical terms? Is it about boat hits iceberg, breaks hull, sinks? And physical explanations, before getting to behavioral, to sort of, I guess, head off potential confusions, physical explanations can involve people and animals, etc., but they have to be like in physical terms. So, for example, if someone's limping, and you say, "Oh, why is that person limping?" and they say they've got a torn MCL, that'd be a physical explanation. It is about a person, but it's something physical about them. Or if it's, why does Sally have a broken arm? And you say, well, she fell off the roof and hit the ground really hard. It'd be a physical explanation, because it is talking about a person, but it's not about their behavior, their thoughts and feelings. It's about the physics of it. On roof, fall, gravity, arm, breaks. So just because it involves a person or an animal, don't automatically go, well, it's got to be behavioral. But so if it describes them in physical terms, if you have a description of how, say, like a disease works or something, or like the breaking of an arm, it's still physical. Now the behavioral explanations, they deal with behavior. So what we call the soft or squishy sciences, things like sociology, anthropology, history, etc., that deal with the feels and the thinking. And so these would be explanations that involve the mental stuff. Just like with the physical, there are endless philosophical debates on what counts as mental. Like our good dead friend Descartes said that the mental is a incorporeal soul, and that it's not extended, it's not in space and time, but it does the thinking. It's a thinky thing. Our good dead friend Tommy Hobbes denied that there's any soul, and said it's all just body. We're purely physical systems. So all thought is just, basically stuff going on in the brain. But we'll go with, again, the common sense view. This would be, behavioral would be things, thinky, feely stuff. So that would be examples. Well, we could go back to our Titanic example. And we could look at it from the standpoint not of the physical science parts of it, but by the behavioral parts. One question might be, why was the Titanic going so fast, and putting itself at risk? Well, one reason is back in those days, before planes, ships were the way, if you wanted to get across the Atlantic, that was pretty much the only option. Not really an option. And the various lines, because back then, they were sort of analogous to the way airlines are today. You would have like the White Star Line, etc., and they would compete with each other to see who could do the journey the fastest, would be part of the competition. And there'd be whoever held the fastest crossing that would be like a record they would hold, and that would attract more passengers. It's kind of like when to use an analogy, it's kind of like when a university wins a national championship in sports. Nothing to do with, there's no connection to the academics, but it draws in people. And so when a ship would win the competition, so they would, get that prestige. Also, of course, the faster they get it done, the faster they can go back to doing it again and make more money. So lots of incentives to go fast. Also, a question would be like, why didn't they see the iceberg? And that would be a question of behavior as well, the wash, if they were sleepy, etc. And then in terms of why so many people died, well, because there weren't enough lifeboats. Why not? Well, they wanted to save money. Lifeboats are expensive, and the only time you use them is when the ship is sinking, and you don't think it's ever going to happen. So those would all be behavioral explanations. They involve what people thought, what people feel, what people, their decision making. Now, one thing about current behavior is that it is yet not fully predictable. Now, it's also true that in the case of physical explanations, there are many of those that are also not fully predictable. For example, we can fully predict if we've got a beaker of water in a lab at normal, at sea level, that we can predict exactly when it's going to start boiling. Fully predictable. But something like trying to fully predict a hurricane can't do this yet. Now, in the case of people, it becomes even more complicated and potentially interesting. In the case of the physical world, we generally think, if only we knew like more and more stuff, and we could build like a really good model, we could predict everything. Which does lead to an interesting and ancient philosophical problem. Namely, is the world determined, so that way everything works purely mechanically, there's no chance, there's no choice, or is the world random? Crudely put, is the world like run by dice, or is it just perfectly scripted? And when it comes to people, it's even more interesting, because you have the question of, do people have free will, or are people, determined? Are they simply running a script, so to speak? And this becomes a practical question when it comes to trying to predict people. Because if you believe people are truly free, then no matter how much data you have, no matter how much computing power you had, you'd never be able to fully predict people, because someone, for no detectable reason, could decide to do something else. Now, physical explanations have been big for a long time. We built our previous technology and economy on these things, developing things like, coal power, then natural gas power, airplanes, trains, planes, automobiles, etc. And now we're kind of in the behavioral explanation age, big data. For example, think of the business model of Facebook. The business model, of course, is people go on there for their free service, and people pour out to Facebook tons of data. Pictures, clicks, likes, dislikes, messages, comments, posts, etc. And what they do is they use that to create models of people, to predict stuff. Specifically, what is it you're probably going to buy, or how do we make you buy stuff? And so the big model today with the Google and Facebook and all those companies, for a variety of purposes. Again, Facebook is in it mostly to make, entirely to make money and sell us stuff. The Russians are into it to basically influence us to screw up our elections. And companies like Google also in it to make tons of money. And so it can be used for the usual kind of evil purpose, exploit people to make tons of money, or other evil purposes like manipulating elections, etc. And what they're trying to do, of course, is build these perfect explanations in which you get all the data and you know what you need to do to get the results you want, to sell, Donald Trump, or sell Joe Biden, or sell sneakers or soda. And so all that stuff is, all the big data stuff is basically behavioral explanations today. You want to figure out why people do what they do, analyze that, get the data, and kind of the ideal would be to create a perfect model of everybody. That way, you would just run your tests on this. You want to know how to, swing the election in favor of Joe Biden, or swing the election in favor of Donald Trump. Well, you can kind of try to do stuff and see what happens, but the perfect ideal would be to have a simulation of people and just try different things and see what the outcome is. And that's kind of the model today, because if you could develop that, that would be the next billion dollar idea. Because you'd you'd be able to figure out how to make stuff work without actually having to try it out there and see what happens. Because you only get one shot at the election, but if you do it this way, you can run it over and over and over again. Kind of like playing a video game. When you get a save, you go through and you're like, I died. Get back to the resave, do it again. And you can kind of do the same thing this way. Now we also use this to move away from the big super big picture. We also use this in everyday life. When we interact with the people, we have models of them in our mind. Namely, how do these people respond? So if you have a friend who's got, everybody's got trigger points, things that set them off, you know that about their behavior. So if you don't feel like enraging them, you don't hit their annoyance points. Or like at work, we all, people we work with, and we know stuff about them, and we predict their behavior. And then people in general, we have models of what annoys people, what provokes them, what makes them, cooperate, and we're engaging in this, constantly. Now, unlike physical explanations, unless you want to get sci-fi and talk about, time travel and backwards causation, we can refer to the future when doing behavioral explanations. So, for example, you were here in the class in order to graduate, something that's in the future. That way you can go on and maybe go on to more school or to a job, then work, and then die. So ultimately, I guess everything is death. So we can refer to goals in the future. Now, physical stuff, typically not, again, unless we're getting kind of sci-fi and referring to like backwards causation, etc. Last thing for these, we naturally have to distinguish between reason and reason, because reason is ambiguous. One version, of course, is reason is what would be a actual, say, motivator or actual, something that would support a premise, evidence, or that would support doing something. Then, of course, there's a person's reason, which is why they did it. And this can be hard to sort out, because we can think of, like, why someone might have done something, versus why they actually did it. And this can be both for good and bad. For example, people who are bad, generally they don't want people to like know they're bad, and they may do things that are part of their bad agenda, but they don't want people to know. So they'll do things that look like they have a good reason, although their own reason is probably pretty bad. So they might, for example, give to charity and appear at all these public functions, and they want people to think that their reason is that they're good and generous, but of course their actual reason might be that they're just trying to look good, for their case they get caught doing bad stuff, so they can bring it up at their trial, or they just plan on using this to influence people, so they can go and do their other bad stuff. And sometimes if someone does something seemingly bad, we would have to look at, okay, what are reasons they might do this versus what was their actual reason. So, for example, if you remember during the battle for governor of Florida, DeSantis made a comment about monkeying around, which struck some people as racist. And he said no, he was just using a common phrase. And so we could give a reason for it, racism, or his reason could be he was just using a common phrase and didn't really think it through. And so we have to separate out what reasons we may have as to why someone did it versus why they're actually doing it. And of course this can be pretty tough because we can't, unlike Bill Clinton, we can't feel other people's pain. We don't gaze into their minds and see what their true heart shows. We have to guess on their behavior. But it's an important point, because there's why we think they're doing it, and there's why they're doing it, which could be the same, or they can be totally separate. And people who are bad are usually pretty careful to always leave some doubt, that you can't exactly pin them down to being, terrible. Looking before pressing on, anything about this stuff? Okay, so key distinctions are physical, deal with the hard sciences, behavioral, deal with the soft, squishy sciences. So basically material stuff, these would be thoughts and feelings. And the sort of questions will be typically distinguishing between these. It'd be like a true false, giving an example saying true or false, this is an example of physical explanation, or true false is an example of behavioral. And they will be to decide based on the definition which one is which. Now, when we make explanations, the question is, just like with arguments for persuasion, what is the win? When does the you have won, victory, flash up on the screen? Well, as I saw in the case of persuasion, you achieve victory when the person accepts it, when they believe it. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not, doesn't matter how you do it, the objective of persuasion is belief. In the case of an argument, you win if you make the case of a deductive argument, it's valid, and you get like super win if it's sound. In the case of an inductive argument, you win if it's strong, and you super win if it's cogent. What about explanation? How do you win the explanation? Well, here's how you win the explanation. First, the basic idea is it's more like persuasion in a way than argumentation, because it's not like you win by getting the truth. You win by getting the person to understand or accept it. So in some ways it's like persuasion, because a lot of it depends on what effect you have on your audience. With an argument, logically speaking, your audience could refuse to accept the truth. They could scream with rage at your conclusion, throw rocks, and refuse to accept it all and be outraged. But logically speaking, you still have won the argument because you got a valid argument or a strong argument. In the case of persuasion, if the audience is screaming with rage what you said, you've lost. Unless you want them screaming with rage at something, then you've won. In the case of an explanation, a large part of it depends on your audience's response. Do they go from less understanding to more? If the answer is yes, you achieve victory. So part of it is, again, like persuasion. It's relative. It depends on what effect you have on the audience. Whereas in an argument, from the standpoint of an argument, it doesn't matter, because the audience is irrelevant to the logic of the argument. It's valid or invalid, strong or weak, regardless of the audience. Unless you're using it as persuasion, then it would just work as persuasion. So a big chunk of it is, how do you affect your audience? Now, but unlike persuasion, it's not entirely subjective, because with persuasion, all that matters is the effect on the audience. Nothing else matters from that standpoint. But with an explanation, there are some objective standards that would make an explanation bad. So even if you enhance someone's understanding a bit, you could still say the explanation was a bad one, a terrible one, because if it doesn't meet these standards, it would not be adequate. Now you could still say, well, even if it's a crappy explanation, I still kind of won because the person now understands a little more. And in that case, you could say, yeah, I guess they did get some understanding. I guess a good analogy would be to go back to kind of like with food. You can think of an explanation like food, and food should have certain minimal things going on to be adequate food. But of course, if someone's starving, almost any food's better than no food. So if all you've got is really awful junk food, better than death. So what would be the sort of minimal requirements? Well, as you might imagine, an explanation can't contradict itself, because if the explanation ends up in a logical contradiction, it's impossible for it to be true, which makes it impossible to be correct. So contradictions, always bad. Now with persuasion, that's fine. You can contradict and contradict over and over, and if the audience loves that, well, there you go. But with an explanation, if it contradicts itself, it's going to be terrible. Vagueness. Now, as we saw before, being too vague means it's too fuzzy. To use my analogy, it's like driving in a fog. It's just, you can't see where you're going. Now, if an explanation is too vague, then it won't work because, well, the person's understanding won't increase because they won't know what you mean. For example, years and years and years and years ago, a friend of mine had a Commodore 64K of memory, really good computer, and it stopped working. And he took it back to the place where he bought it and had him look at it. The guy comes out and says, dude, it's baked. And of course that's an explanation, but not particularly useful. Baked like a potato, how baked, what does that mean? And after a little while, we were able to figure out that basically what he meant was that it was, baked meant totally irreparable, which is what he probably should have said in the first place. Because bake's pretty vague. Now, vagueness, of course, depends on the context. So, if you go to, say, print up paper, and there's a sign on the printer saying, broken, that's all the explanation you need. You don't need to know, like, well, is it that the printer drum is broken? Is it that the toner, the fuser is broken? Is it that the drive motor for the paper is broken? Is it that the USB connection is broken? You don't need to know. You just need to know, I want to print, it's broken, I can't, that's all I need. So vagueness depends on the context. So too vague is not absolute, but relative. Now in general, of course, the way you fix vagueness in an explanation is add more details. And there is kind of a art to deciding how much to add. In general, if you're not sure, like, should I add like some more, or would that be like unnecessary? In general, the more important is the more you want to put on there, because if there's too much, it's easy for people just to ignore it, because people are good at that. If there is too little, that means the person either has to go put extra work to go find more, which is more work, or that if they can't find it, they have no idea. But of course, you don't want to go too far, because it can become, people look at it and say, that's too much. But in general, it's kind of the test would be, if you're not entirely sure, like maybe I should include this, maybe I should not, and if it's an important thing to explain, like put that in there. For example, like with, medicine. Doctors nowadays, they've always been in a real hurry, so if you have like a major surgery, they might talk to you for just like a couple minutes. And, you probably may have all kinds of questions. And they may just leave, their explanation may be pretty vague about what you should do and how you should do things. And that could be a problem, because you may not know, like, what do I do? So in a case where it's pretty important, you'd want to put in, like, more. Because then the person can just kind of ignore that extra. But in practical cases, time is often a factor. So you'd have to balance that out. Next, of course, is the problem with ambiguity. As we saw back in the ancient days, you can have something that has two or more meanings, and it's not clear what is intended. So if someone gives an explanation that's ambiguous, it can mean one thing or another, then it's not going to help, because you don't know, is it this thing or that thing. Last two. One way we test our explanations, or one way we sort of see if they're good, bad, or ugly, is we put them in the context of established facts and theories. Now, as a general rule, if an explanation doesn't fit established facts and theories, that's a strike against it. Now, to be fair, of course, it can turn out the established facts and theories were wrong. And it turns out, history is replete with examples of this, where we have an explanation as to how something works, and then later on we're like, oh, it doesn't work like that, because we were wrong. For example, think about medical theories. There are the, kind of obvious extreme examples. For example, during the early plague, if you've had a history class that covers a plague, you might have seen the pictures of the doctors, and they have those weird masks with the really long noses. You wonder, what is that? That's terrifying. And the reason why was they believed that some people believe that the plague arose from bad smells, which is not totally off, because smells, when you smell something, it's because there's little particles of it that we're getting in our nose. So not totally stupid. But of course they didn't protect people. Having a big nose thing to protect you from bad smells wouldn't work. Also, but back in the day, the facts and theories, well, we didn't really have much of a theory of contagion. And so that explanation is caused by bad smells. We didn't have an established theory, we really can't test it. Now, of course, today we know that the plague wasn't caused by bad smells or demons or witches. It was caused by a bacteria that's, in a flea that gets on rats. And when the rats die, they get on us, and then we get the plague. And the plague's still a real thing. It's still around. Not so much in the US, but still around. And so now, if we have an explanation of, trying to explain like why people have the plague, and someone says, well, it's the wrath of God, well, that's medieval. We know that it's not God wrathing people, it's bacteria or viruses infecting people. But of course, when we had the AIDS epidemic, there were people who claimed that it was, God was doing it, which, but then when it spread to the general population, the explanation kind of didn't have as much appeal. So we have to see how it matches with our existing facts and theories. And again, keeping in mind that these could be overturned. And good, historical examples are like in the Middle Ages, theories of disease, they get overturned, they were wrong. Now, the most important thing about explanations is testability. And one way to show an explanation is bad is that it leads to false predictions. In other words, if you get an explanation and it's right, then it should, a definition of being right, get things right. Now, one thing that can make this complicated is there can be things that are a matter of probability. For example, everyone's probably had like a computer or a car problem where the problem happens like sometimes. It's not like always happening. Like you're working on a computer and, well, this happened to me the other day. Copy paste just stopped working in all programs. I could copy, but every time I pasted nothing happened. But it doesn't happen all the time. It happens once in a while. Similarly, like you may have like your car, maybe occasionally the engine, runs rough or you get a backfire or something, but it doesn't happen all the time. And so when you're giving an explanation, it may be that the explanation is good, but the prediction is not going to be 100% because it doesn't happen all the time. So, but the ideal, of course, is that if the explanation is really good, then it should give you a reliable prediction. So if something just happens like some of the time, and the cause doesn't always bring about the effect, it should give you a good prediction. For example, if the prediction is the car is, say, running rough or backfiring because of, say, a bad spark plug, then the prediction would be replacing the spark plug should fix it. Or if the claim is the problem with being able to copy paste is there something wrong with the the Windows registry or some DLL, then fixing that should solve the problem. Or if someone is having trouble sleeping and they think maybe it's all that Starbucks, double latte, mocha, choca, caffo, whatever they call those things. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's all that caffeine. And they cut out the caffeine and they are able to get to sleep. That'd be a decent explanation. But if the explanation gives false predictions, someone says, well, I'm having trouble sleeping because I'm not watching enough, TV, and they stop watching TV, they watch more and more TV and they still don't sleep well, that would be not a good explanation. This takes us to testability. So if you have an explanation, how do you tell if it's good, bad, or ugly? Well, again, these are kind of the minimal conditions. If it contradicts itself, it's too vague or ambiguous, it's not going to help because it's too fuzzy to let the person know what it's actually saying. In this case, it's got two or more meanings, not clear what it's intended. This one makes it a problem because it doesn't match, what we already have established. And leading to false predictions means that it's not working. So testability, the way we see if our explanation is good or not, is this. We take our explanation, and our explanation would lead to a prediction. For example, suppose you have your phone, and your phone's fine. It's phone in Facebook and Instagramming, Snapchatting, etc. And then you download the next, iOS update, and then you're like, can't get past the lock screen. Well, in that case, the explanation might be, as is often the case, that the update caused a problem. And so a prediction would be, if I take out the update and restore my phone, to a previous backup, pre-update, then it should work. And that would be a prediction, and it'd be testable. So if you do that, if you go, plug your phone into a computer, go get iTunes, restore a backup on a previous one, and it goes back to working fine, then that would help, confirm that explanation. Now, the explanation could still be wrong. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe when it was updating, something else happened. Got some malware in there or something. And so the idea is, whenever you get an explanation, it should give a prediction that you can test. Or as another example, suppose someone does really badly on a test, and they want to know why, because you don't want to keep doing bad, and they may think, well, what occurred? And if they check and say, well, I really didn't study at all, maybe that's why. And so they can predict is, maybe if I study, if the cause is, the explanation is I didn't study, try studying. And so if they study next time and do well, then that was testable. And the prediction turned out to be correct. So it would be reasonable to consider that studying was a possible cause. Now, interestingly, there can be explanations that are non-testable. And non-testable explanations are effectively useless, though they might be interesting, because you can't, by definition, test them. And the reason why that's important is because you can never know if they're correct or incorrect. I mean, to use sort of a metaphor, if there was like a disease that would be completely untestable, there's just no way to test for it, well, a person could never know if they had it because there'd be no way to test for it. It'd be a total mystery. And the same with an explanation. If an explanation is untestable, you have no idea if it's good or bad or not because there's no way to tell. Now, we have to separate out things that are untestable versus things that are not testable now. Because there are things that we can't test now, but would be in theory testable. For example, take things involving, they go beyond our ability to examine with our current technology. So back before the microscope, people did have a theory there were little organisms that were causing disease. But before we had a microscope, we couldn't really test that very well because we couldn't see them. Now we got a microscope, and then we can see, yeah, there's stuff there. And then, of course, we got better microscopes. We got scanning electron microscopes, and now we have even better stuff. And so as our technology improves, things that we couldn't test before because we didn't have the tech, we could test now. So untestable doesn't mean you can't test it now. It would mean that it would be untestable. Now, as you might imagine, it's usually, well, sometimes it's legitimate stuff that's just kind of weird. For example, metaphysics, and even sort of, well, science that is metaphysics, has many things that do seem to be non-testable. For example, well, here's one. It's a real serious, problem, question, but utterly untestable. And it's the classic problem of free will. Namely, are we free to make our choices where we decide? Or one explanation is we're basically robots. We're pre-programmed, and we just run out our. Think of like a scripted character in a video game. We just run out our script. If you ever play video games and they have the boss fight, the boss always follows that script, and they always move in that pattern. And then there are courses that we're free to choose. So you can take the example of like going someplace, and there's the menu. If you believe that we're not free, then before you even open the menu, it's already determined what you're going to pick. You don't actually choose. It's just mechanical. It's like when it's like water running down a hill. It's not deciding, ooh, I'm going to go around this rock and then cut over this way and do this. It just does. It can't do otherwise. The view, of course, that we have free will, of course, is that we are picking. We're gazing upon the menu, and we are freely choosing. We can select anything on there. It is all up to us to do this. Now, of course, this is utterly untestable. How so? Well, a world in which we were free would look just like this world, utterly indistinguishable. A world in which we're not free would look exactly the same way. There'd be no difference. There is literally no way to tell if we're free or not. Now, in psychology, they've sometimes said, well, what if you could go to a parallel world and you could watch yourself, that parallel you ordering and see if that parallel you ordered something different. But of course, that wouldn't prove you have free will because the parallel you is not you. They're just ordering whatever they would order. So free will is an interesting, point. Maybe we do all we do because we were free or because we're determined. But there's no way to test that. Totally untestable. And we'll never know. Unless, of course, like God comes down and says, hey, yeah, I totally get your free will. You got that. So there's some that are non-testable because there would be no way to test it. Again, there's nothing we could do or look at aside from God coming down and saying, you got free will, where we could tell. So what about things that are non-testable, but just, kind of just deceits? Well, a good example of this is psychic phenomena. Back in the, psychics are still big today. I was kind of surprised to hear that because apparently they're still big. They were super big in the 1920s. The mediums who would contact dead people and talk to them. But now apparently they have their own TV shows and stuff too. I just haven't been following that kind of thing. I thought the mediums had gotten taken care of a while ago. But I guess they're back again. And of course there are people who claim that they can bend spoons and move things from their minds, etc. Now, if people had that power, of course, you'd want to be able to test it. And so if someone says they have, psychic powers, and you try to test it, commonly this is what happens. There was a case where there was a famous psychic, and they apparently could, do the spoon bending, but they could also apparently move the pages of a book without touching it. They would, go and do this, and the pages would flip. And somebody suspected this guy, the Amazing Randy, who debunked, psychics, etc. He figured the person was probably really trained and could breathe out little puffs of air very precisely, which is a pretty impressive trick, but not a psychic trick. So what he did is he put a plastic cube over the book and said, hey, can you do this? And the person's like, and he said, oh, the plastic's interfering with my psychic powers, the conditions are wrong. And so every time the Amazing Randy came up with a way to test it, the psychic would say, oh, it's interfering with my powers. And so effectively what the psychic did is they made their power untestable. Because there's nothing you could do that would show that they did or didn't have it, according to them. Because every time Amazing Randy would try something, they'd say, oh, that's blocking my power, but I still got it. And so if you can't test it, then the explanation is effectively useless. Now you could say, well, maybe it's true. Maybe plastic really does block his psychic power. But that would be kind of weird, because then you could do it with like paper or something. So there's some explanations that are untestable because you just can't, like free will. And there are some that sort of people intentionally make them, by moving the goalposts, make them untestable. And of course that's not a good explanation either. Finally, circular explanations. These are ones that run in a circle. Now in some cases it'll just be repeating the same thing twice. But a common way this is done is by saying the same thing twice, but with slightly different words. For example, if someone's trying to write and they can't, and someone says, why can't they write? And the person says, they have writer's block. Not really an explanation, because writer's block is not a thing. It simply means they can't write. So they're just saying they can't write because they can't write. Doesn't explain it. And so we have to watch for explanations that are circular. Now sometimes people do this in ways that are designed to, well, not surprisingly, cut off argument. So, for example, if someone says that, you know, something should be illegal because it's against the law, but of course, being against the law means it's just illegal. This says it's illegal because it's illegal. So it doesn't really explain why it's illegal, it just says that it is. Okay, so recap here. So when's an explanation good? Well, the informal standard again is you win the explanation when the person's understanding increases. So a bit relative. But there are certain sort of minimal conditions. It can't contradict itself, can't be too vague, can't be ambiguous, can't be incompatible with established facts or theories, keeping in mind that these later can be overturned, and if it leads to false predictions, then it's going to be wrong. The critical thing, which is the sort of foundation of science, is testability. You got to be able to come up with a prediction that you can test, and the authors don't mention this, but it's a key part of the method is, of course, repeatability. You got to be able to test it and consistently get the same results. Keep in mind that some things may be probability. You don't always get the result because it's a matter of probability, but it would need to be consistent. Interestingly, a huge part of psychology, the tests, things that have been published and served, tests and studies, turned out to be unrepeatable. So there we go. And of course, circular ones are bad. Before pressing on, anything on this stuff that needs more stuff. So likely questions would be things like, well, multiple choice, like good explanations must be, then having the stuff there, then general questions, true, false about testability. Now, another bad thing for explanations is too much complexity, namely unnecessary complexity. Now, why is this, a bad thing? Well, here's the idea. Unnecessary complexity doesn't mean that you would say, oh, this theory is, complex so that it's false. It's that the complexity is unnecessary. It's not doing stuff. So, how do you tell? Well, kind of the theory behind this goes back to our good dead friend William of Ockham. And his name is spelled a variety of ways. And he came up with this thing, although there's some will say he really came up with it, called Occam's razor. And in his original version, it was do not multiply entities beyond necessity. And it's a principle of metaphysics. The idea being that when you're talking about what kind of things there are, not things like kiwis and chairs and squirrels, but metaphysical entities like souls, space, time, God. If you can explain something without using that, then that entity is unnecessary. So by the razor, to chop it away. Now this has been, as you might imagine, has been expanded to cover a broad range of things. So you'll sometimes see on police procedural shows people saying, oh, Occam's razor. And what they mean is they'll be talking about, the explanation for some crime, and one will be like super complicated, and the other will be a much more simple, direct one. And the idea is that the simpler is the better. And so the basic idea is that if you have two explanations, and one's got more stuff, more necessary complexity, then the simpler one, the one with less stuff, is better, supposedly. What would be an example of this? Well, we can take kind of a weird example. There's a phenomena known worldwide as night terrors, and it occurs in the following way. A person is asleep, typically, then they awaken, but they find that they cannot move. They're fully conscious, but no matter how much they try, no matter how much they struggle, they can't move at all. And worse, they feel that there's something terrible, something malicious, something malign, something evil in the room with them. They can't see it, but they can't turn their head to see if it's behind them, and it moves closer ever closer, something terrible, something evil. Now, one explanation for this has been demons and witches. The person is visited by a witch or a demon that's, paralyzed them, and it's like standing behind them up to something terrible. And then in the 1950s and later, it became aliens. They paralyzed the person, and they're about to do probably some probing or something. So one explanation would be, aliens, witches, demons. Another explanation, because people wonder about this, originally, of course, scientists kind of dismissed it, saying, yeah, that's just, myths and legends. And they found that it's still persistent. People still claim, rational, sane people said, yeah, I think this happens. And so they investigated it. And what they found out happened is, kind of crudely put, is this. When we sleep, our brain is like a safety switch. You might have wondered, like, when I'm dreaming that I'm running around and doing things, why aren't I, like, doing all that stuff? Because in your dreams, you're taking out, you're moving and stuff. Why doesn't your body go and do that? And now in some cases, you do move around. And everyone's seen the dogs, they're dreaming and they do the little running thing, barking. And we kind of do that too. Probably not too much barking, but who knows. Now, normally though, we get a little safety switch, crudely put, that sort of disengages our brain from our body. So we're thinking about running or talking, and we don't. We just lay there safely, not running around. But of course, like any safety switch, that can malfunction. And so what can happen is you can wake up, so your brain clicks on, but the safety is still like caught, so you can't actually move. And they found that going along with this is a sensation of that there's something there, some terrible, terrible presence. And they found they could recreate this in the lab. They could put like electrodes on someone and juice them up, and they would have that feeling. And so we get two explanations. One is, witches, demons, or aliens. The other is you just get a part of your brain and it's temporarily malfunctions. Now, this one, of course, is much more complicated. It's got more stuff. This one explains everything this one does, but with less complexity and less stuff. And so by this principle, that's the better explanation. Now, another example of how it's used, which is kind of ironic because the original Occam's razor was that God did things in simple ways, so that way unnecessary complexity would be cut away. It was later, the razor was later used to cut away God. That's how that worked. So, you get everything. And one explanation is that God creates it, and then God creates all the, over the course of 6 days, creates all the living creatures, humans, animals, etc. The other explanation is you have the world, but no God. And it just arose out of like Big Bang or whatever you want to call it. And then life gets started by just kind of random chemical processes, and then it evolves up to us. So you have two explanations. One is God creates everything, creates us, Adam and Eve, and that's the story. The other is that everything arises out of the Big Bang, then eventually you get the Earth, about 5 billion years ago, chemical, stuff happens, maybe like lightning hits a pool of hydrocarbons, you get cells, and then eventually, billions of years later, you get us, in drawing this forth. And so the argument is, well, you can explain everything without God, so you don't need God. And that's kind of one of the stock arguments from atheists. You have the argument that you just don't need God to explain stuff. Once you've got Big Bang and evolution, you don't need God. Which, if you ever wondered, didn't know why people like, God generally don't like, Big Bang evolution, it's because of that reason. Because there are many arguments that say if you got those, you don't need God. But there are people who do accept, Big Bang, evolution, and God. They believe God, is behind all that. So, but the usual argument is, you got this, don't need that. So, when you get a good explanation, it's got to be consistent, not conflict with established facts and theory, be testable, not be circular, and avoid that extra stuff. In other words, simpler, better. Before pressing on our remaining minutes, anything about that stuff that needs more stuff? turn to the actual methodology, namely, how do you go about explaining something? And this is called, in technical terms, forming a hypothesis. An hypothesis is this. It is a tentative, potential explanation you put forth to provide an account of something. Now, when it's a hypothesis, you haven't, gotten your answer yet. Crudely put, it's kind of like brainstorming. So, hypothesis is what you're putting forth with the purpose of putting it to the test to see if it actually works. Once you've tested it, you'll either reject it, accept it, or maybe put it on hold for maybe later testing. Now, this, of course, is what they typically do, the sciencey stuff, but it's something we also do every day. So, like in the sciences, they might have a hypothesis that a particular chemical causes cancer, or that the results on a test are a result of a new subatomic particle. But we form hypotheses constantly. For example, if you interact with somebody who's normally friendly and they're kind of grumpy and mean, you try to come up with an explanation. You wouldn't say I'm coming up with a hypothesis about why they're so mean, but you'd think of reasons why they're so mean. Or if you're running a business and sales are going down, you wouldn't say, aha, I need to create a hypothesis, to test to see what the cause of this is. You'd be wondering, why are my sales going down? And you think of various reasons, and those would all be hypotheses. And then, if you want to solve the problem, you then test them to see which one, if any, is correct. Now, this takes us back to our old friend, the inference to the best explanation. So, roughly what we're doing is, we would have a thing happening. Sometimes bad, like sales dropping, a friend who's being like crazy and mean, or feeling tired or sick or doing badly on the test, or maybe something good. Maybe your sales are skyrocketing, or your views on the YouTubes and Instagrams are shooting up, or you're doing great on the test, or you feel great, and you want to, of course, keep that going. And so you've got a situation either you want to solve or continue. And then what you do is you would think up what are the possible explanations, come up with these hypotheses. Then what you're trying to do is this inference. Which one of these best explains what's occurring? So how do you do this testing? And back when we talked about this, I talked about how in the future we would see how this was done. And the future is now. It has arrived. Now, these methods the authors use came from our good dead friend, John Stuart Mill. He was a philosopher, English, wrote a lot of books. In addition to these methods, he's best known for his theory of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. And then, of course, he died. And he's still dead today. And he developed these three methods: difference, agreement, and concomitant variation, which the authors have knocked down to two: difference and agreement. Now, these methods are methods of causal reasoning, and they're something we already do. It's something you've already used these methods. It's just that you probably haven't heard these names before. Now, in our last minute, basically what's going on here is this. With difference, you're looking at, shockingly enough, the difference between things. And the difference between them is probably potential cause. Method agreement, you're looking at the similarities between them, and the similarity is probably the cause. And next time, on Tuesday, we'll see how to work these methods. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on the Tuesday.